Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar called Trust as the Foundation for Mental Wellness at Work. I can see we have people still logging on to our system, but we'll go ahead and get started and they can join us when they get here. And so I wanted to introduce our speakers for today. My name is Alison Grenier. I'm the head of culture and research for Great Place to Work, and I'm honored to be here with guest speaker Graham Lowe. Graham has over 30 years of organizational, labor market, and policy consulting experience across Canada and internationally. He's president of the Graham Lowe Group, a workplace consulting and research firm. Graham is Professor Emeritus at the University of Alberta and has been a visiting professor, lecturer, and researcher at other universities in Canada, Europe, and Asia. Graham is the author of Creating Healthy Organizations: How Vibrant Workplaces Inspire Employees to Achieve Sustainable Success. He's currently working on a thoroughly updated second edition of this book. His latest book with Frank Graves is entitled Redesigning Work: A Blueprint for Canada's Future Wellbeing and Prosperity. Graham has given hundreds of conference talks and workshops across Canada and internationally. And I must say it's a special privilege to have Graham with us here today. Graham was the founding partner of Great Place to Work Institute Canada back in 2005 when we started here. So it's a delight to be for us to be working together again on this project. So just a brief overview of what we'll cover today. I'll kick us off by providing some insights from our recently released list of best workplaces for mental wellness. Then Graham will provide context on the broader workplace wellness landscape with insights from his book, Creating Healthy Organizations. And we should then have about 20 minutes left for Q&A. So now's probably a good time for me to mention that you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation by using the question or chat feature on your GoToWebinar panel. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. If you don't see the question panel, you may have that panel minimized, so just click the orange arrow and that should open it up. And so what we'll do is gather questions as we go and then compile them at the end, and we'll get to as many questions as we can today. So this promises to be a very full 1 hour, so let's get started. Before we dive in, I'll provide a very brief introduction to our organization for those of you who may not be familiar. Great Place to Work is a global people analytics and consulting firm that helps companies of all sizes achieve better business results by focusing on the work experience for every employee. Our research shows a clear and direct relationship between employee experience and key business performance results. We work with organizations of all sizes and industries around the world to identify and build high-trust, high-performance workplace cultures. Everything we do is driven by our mission to build a better world by helping every organization become a great place to work for all. Great Place to Work runs the world's largest employee survey, each year surveying over 12 million employees in 8,000 organizations in 57 countries. Based on 30 years of research, our Trust Index survey platform provides organizations with the data and insights they need to drive their people and their culture forward. And this extensive database also forms the basis of our recognition programs. Organizations that take the survey and meet our minimum standards can be certified as a great place to work. And from that pool of certified companies, the best are ranked on our national list of best workplaces in Canada, which is published each April in the Globe and Mail. Certified organizations can also be recognized on one of our feature lists for excellence in a specific region, industry, or area of practice. And many of you are aware that earlier this month, we released our first list of best workplaces for mental wellness, and this is the focus of today's webinar. So let's take a look at some of the insights we gained from our study on these best workplaces for mental wellness. Most of you on the line today don't need to be convinced of the need for action in the area of workplace mental wellness. We all know that mental health issues are prevalent in the workplace and the broader Canadian economy. And many of you may have even seen these statistics from a recent Statistics Canada report and the Mental Health Commission of Canada. So 3 out of 5 employees have experienced mental health issues in the past year because of work, but only 23% of those would disclose their mental illness to their employer. More than 1 in 3 employees and managers report being more stressed now than 5 years ago. But 2/3 of those facing mental health challenges don't access help. So overall, mental illness affects 20% of the Canadian population and costs $50 billion a year. The past decade has seen an explosion of some very excellent workplace mental health resources. But many organizations are still telling us that they're struggling to apply these resources to their own workplace setting, that their specific interventions are not really having the desired impact of fostering mental health in their workplace, and that overall their workplace mental wellness efforts sometimes feel a bit fragmented or disjointed. So earlier this year, Great Place to Work partnered with Sklar Wiltons and Associates, and we set out to study the issue of workplace mental wellness in a more integrated and holistic way. We explored the relationship between workplace trust and mental wellness, and we studied what the best workplaces are doing to foster mental wellness at work and provide some key takeaways and best practices that employers can look at and relate to and put into practice. A little bit about our methodology for this study. We looked at over 66,000 survey responses from over 300 Canadian organizations from 2018. And essentially, we compared the top and bottom quartile mental wellness organizations. These were categorized based on the percentage of employees that respond positively to our mental wellness index. This is a subset of our trust index. So today I'm going to be presenting a few highlights from this research, but just know that the full research report and the mental wellness index can be found in our publication, Trust as the Foundation for Mentally Healthy Workplaces, and this is available by free download on our website. And we'll provide a link to this a bit later in today's session. So based on our research, we created a mental wellness framework to help us sort of understand and conceptualize what a mentally healthy workplace looks like. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we have recognized that promotion of mental wellness at work is based not only on formal programs, but also on informal practices and behavioral expectations in the workplace. So what we did was we examined those 66,000 Trust Index surveys, and we identified 5 key components of mentally healthy workplaces, which are seen to a much higher degree in mental wellness organizations. So these are components that mentally healthy workplaces seem to have the most in common. The first one, culture and values. So in other words, this would be like the way we do things around here. In top quartile mental wellness organizations, employees responded 35% more positively to statements relating to their culture and their values. Employee empowerment is the second one. This is supporting employees for their expected deliverables. And here we see a 34% increase in mentally healthy organizations. Then we move on to fairness of treatment. This one was a little bit of a surprise for us. We didn't expect it to rank quite so highly. But when people feel they have equal access to pay, benefits, and advancement within the organization, this is certainly a characteristic of mentally healthy organizations. And then the fourth one, flexibility and balance. So this is giving employees some say in how, when, and where their work gets done. And finally, healthy work environment, physical and psychological safety of the workplace. Perhaps the most significant finding of this study was the interconnectedness we found between trust and mental wellness. When people experience a high level of workplace trust, they're 32% more likely to experience a workplace that is mentally healthy. And the reverse is also true. The absence of workplace trust makes it virtually impossible to experience mental wellness at work. And so you can see on the right-hand side, our model also speaks to some of the business outcomes of a mentally healthy workplace. So again, by comparing the top and bottom quartile mental health organizations, we found that mentally healthy workplaces are not just better for people, they're also better for business. Employees working in top quartile mental wellness organizations responded much higher on a range of key business outcomes, including employee engagement, innovation, adaptability, teamwork, talent retention, customer service, and being proud company ambassadors. So it's clear that mental health issues have a significant impact on the workplace, and it's also clear that creating a mentally healthy workplace can have a significant impact on your business. But what is not so clear is what employers can or should do to support employees who are struggling. So in our research report, we suggest taking a three-pronged approach. So first and foremost, employers have a legal responsibility to do no harm to the mental health of their employees by maintaining a workplace which is free from bullying and harassment. So no surprise there. Secondly, mental illness is a serious condition that requires treatment and support from trained mental health professionals. Employers play a key role in providing for and connecting employees with these supports and treatments needed. But third, employers are encouraged to take all this to the next level by fostering a strong mental wellness culture at work. In some cases, this isn't about introducing new wellness programs. It's more about fine-tuning what you're already doing so it lands more effectively with your employees. So in other words, it's less about what you do than how you do it and the culture you create. So to support this theoretical framework, we introduced the employer guide I mentioned earlier, and we distilled all this data and research into top 10 tips for employers. And so here you can see the top 10 tips, and I just want to point out these top 10 areas really do integrate many sources of data, so including our key findings from our trust index, from our mental wellness index, from comments from employees themselves, from aggregate company data on what people are doing to build their mental wellness culture, and most importantly, from best practices from the employers that we work with. So it's always these stories that we learn best from. So all of these 10 tips are included in the guide I referenced, but I'll just take you through a couple of them now so you can see what sort of recommendations. When you look at this list, it maybe looks a little bit broader than what you would expect to see on a mental wellness culture checklist, but you'll see how these things are all interrelated. So as I mentioned, number 4, instill fairness. This was one of the more surprising findings for us because it wasn't what we expected to see sort of at the top of the heap for the factors influencing people's sense of mental wellness at work. Employee perceptions of fairness at work are really strongly connected with workplace mental health. Things like favoritism, unfair promotion or recognition practices, and unequal face time with leaders, these things can all have a really negative impact on employee mental wellness. In fair and inclusive workplaces, leaders welcome and expect great things from all their employees, regardless of their background, position, personal characteristics. And so just digging into the data a little bit, people who believe they're treated as a full member regardless of their position are 231% more likely to agree their workplace is psychologically and emotionally healthy. Along that same vein, people who believe their organization has a fair appeals process are 169% more likely to agree their workplace is psychologically and emotionally healthy. So that's this data right from our survey based on 66,000 employees. That's what that data is telling us in terms of correlations. So what does this look like in a real life organization? So we've picked a best practice from G Adventures. They're an adventure travel company. And they have a younger demographic, and they aspire to provide excellent training and development opportunities to all staff. But they recognize that there's groups of individuals that inherently don't receive the same opportunities for growth and mentorship, just because of the way they are. They're maybe the quiet people rather than the squeaky wheels. So to address this, they've introduced the Guidance Mentorship Program, which calls out their like-me biases and matches people with mentors based solely on their developmental goals and coaching strengths. So there's a great example of trying to instill fairness in the workplace, which results in a mentally healthy workplace. Oh, I'm just having a hard time getting to the next slide here. There we go. Okay, so the next one we'll talk about, the next top tip for employers is number 5, empowering employees to do their best work. Giving employees some say in how, when, and where work gets done shows that the organization recognizes employees as people with lives outside of work. So setting clear expectations and then equipping employees with the tools and resources they need to get the job done, this sets employees up for maximum contribution and impact. And so from our data, we see that people who feel they're encouraged to balance their work and personal lives are 169% more likely to agree their workplace is psychologically and emotionally healthy. And so I remember earlier I mentioned it's not necessarily about what you're doing, but how you're doing it. One of the insights from our data shows that 94% of top quartile mental wellness organizations actually do offer employees flexibility in scheduling their work hours. And 92% allow employees to work from home or telecommute on a regular or as needed basis. So this shows that organizations are backing up this commitment with policy. So a great example of this is Kronos. They're a company that cares deeply about their people, and they have an open paid time off policy. And so that really means open paid time off. So employees can take whatever time they need off. So this is Kronos' way of showing this deep care and trust to employees. And employees are free to use this time any way they need to in order to strike maximum work-life harmony. And also, I'll share with you number 9. This one is about recognition. Let employees know they're valued. And what we know from our research is that people who feel they make a difference are 151% more likely to agree their workplace is psychologically and emotionally healthy. And people who feel that management shows appreciation for them or for their good work are 138% more likely to agree their workplace is psychologically healthy. I put this in, it's a nice quote. We received lots of great quotes from employees as part of our survey, and many of them speak directly to what contributes to their mental wellness at work. This employee says, my mental health stays positive because I know my hard work will be recognized and rewarded. So here you have a Cactus employee making that direct connection between recognition and mental wellness. A great example of valuing employees comes from TJX Canada. Their president sends out personal handwritten notes to associates he's heard good news about. So these notes are for things like promotions, special achievements, what have you. And the associates, of course, are thrilled to receive these personal notes of thanks and recognition. The president sends about 200 to 300 of these notes per year. So that's a great example of letting employees know they're valued. So we just finished talking about some of the specific actions employers can take to foster mental wellness at work. I talked about 3 of them, but of course all 10 are listed in the employer guide. And what we encourage people to do is take a look at those top 10 tips and pick one that you can personally work on in the coming year. So those are some of the specific actions. But I want to shift gears a bit here and invite Graham, turn it over to Graham, who will present the broader context for workplace mental wellness, as well as some of the trends emerging in this field. Here you go, Graham.
Thank you, Alison, and good day, everyone. It's morning here in BC, afternoon for those of you in other parts of Canada further to the east. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be collaborating with Great Place to Work Canada on this important initiative. I think what they have done in really mining their data, excellent quality data, to focus on wellness and the wellness practices that Alison has just explained to you, really will go a long way to helping many organizations take the steps that they're going to need to actually improve the overall health and well-being of their workforce. So for my part, what I'd like to do is talk about, as Alison said, the broader context. And I'm going to be connecting some of the big dots. What are those dots? Well, basically, it's the evidence that's available on healthy workplaces. It's the wide range of concepts that have been thrown out over the last decade or longer, talking about how you make workplaces healthier. And it's also the practices that really go into improving workplaces so that they can be mentally, physically, emotionally, and socially healthy. There's been, as Alison mentioned earlier, an explosion of resources. I want to be helping you to pull together what some of those resources are and how you can see how they interconnect. That there's a lot of things that are out there that in fact are all moving in the same direction. So I want to just highlight that. Alison also mentioned that there's a lot of fragmented initiatives that organizations are taking. I mean, it's great that many employers and more employers are taking action to improve mental health in their workplace, but it's also the case that many are seeing that maybe they're falling short of achieving the goals they want, or that they've got too much going on. So what I'd also like to do is emphasize the importance of an integrated and holistic approach to creating a mentally healthy workplace. And finally, I really want to look at the Great Place to Work Institute's data from some of their surveys and take quite a different perspective, but very complementary to the perspective that Alison has just provided you. I'm going to be mining that data and making some, what I think are very interesting connections with psychological health and safety in the workplace, and more on that later. And finally, I'm going to talk about how trust is absolutely the foundation of a healthy workplace. And one of the things that has really struck me in reviewing just really a ton of published research, much of it in the academic literature, on how to create healthy and safe workplaces, is while much of this expert research emphasizes the importance of a culture, it says very little about how trust is really central to the kind of culture that's needed. So more on that. Alison mentioned that I am now working on a thoroughly revised, updated second edition of Creating Healthy Organizations. You can see the book cover on the left there. And this book really tried, it's been out now almost 10 years, but what I really set out to do initially was to show the very basic building blocks of an organization that in all of its operations, in all of its people practices and its strategy was truly healthy and sustainable. So I focused on culture. I looked at how the workplace itself and people's jobs were designed. That's the vibrant workplace piece. I looked at how leadership in a truly healthy organization has to be inclusive. Yes, you definitely need the direction to be set from the top, and you need very credible leaders at the top, but you also need people at all levels of the organization taking responsibility for making their workplace healthy, safe, and productive. And finally, when you've got all of that in place, you're going to really inspire employees. And that's really what the Great Place to Work Institute is all about, creating that kind of environment that is going to make people feel thoroughly engaged and wanting to contribute in their jobs on a daily basis. So in looking at what's happened over the last 10 years, I just want to highlight some of the things that really stand out. And these are the kinds of issues that I'm going to be addressing in the new edition of the book, Creating Healthy Organizations. And I've just merely selected a couple of things to illustrate how far our thinking and the evidence has gone. So on the left is a recent book by a Stanford professor of organizational studies. So here's somebody who focuses on organizations and organizational performance. And what his latest book does is zero in on stress and how stress not only is detracting from organizational performance, but moreover is a major killer in the US workforce. And he's got all kinds of data in there showing that in fact, stress kills more people than smoking does. And he talks about the ways that you can actually go about redesigning organizations and jobs to reduce stress. And this, of course, is just amplifying the importance of addressing stress as one of the really central mental health challenges of the 21st century. The second image is from the Harvard Business Review. And what's interesting here is that this is an issue that came out some years ago, and the big happy face on the front is basically telling us that when you've got happy employees, in other words, employees that have really a very positive state of well-being, you're going to have a very successful business. And this whole focus on happiness, which is simply another way or a more colloquial way of talking about well-being, comes out of a new and very rapidly growing area of research called positive psychology. And the focus of positive psychology is finding ways to ensure that all employees in a workplace are able to flourish. And that's the term that's used. How can you create a work environment that really enables people to flourish? And Alison has given some very important tips in that regard. And then on the right side of this slide, Alison mentioned the resources that are available now. Well, one of the outstanding resources in Canada, free, is the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. And it's been receiving a lot of attention in a lot of organizations. In fact, I'd be interested in knowing, I know we can't take a kind of an instant poll here, but I'm guessing that a good number of you on the line have either considered ways that you can adopt the standard or in fact have already done that. So it's really drawn a lot of attention in workplaces to how you make them psychologically healthy and safe. Why do we need to look at ways to integrate and to pull together many of the initiatives that are out there to make workplaces healthier, safer, more engaging, and more productive? Well, my experience working in a lot of large organizations is that they have many separate initiatives going on. So they've got corporate social responsibility, which is a very growing area, and that focuses on sustainability. It's being covered in an area quite separate from human resources. And then they'll have a separate area that focuses on workplace health promotion and wellness. And then there's occupational health and safety. So, in one organization I worked with recently, health and safety is in an entirely different area away from human resources and wellness. So while this organization has, fairly robust and well-functioning health and safety committees and wellness committees, the two don't really communicate much with each other. So, that's a practical example of the need for pulling these initiatives together. You're basically going to get a much more effective set of interventions in your workplace. And other areas are, well, looking at culture. The way that the word culture is used in many workplaces today is to talk about the need for a culture of health. And at the same time, those organizations, and typically this goes back some years, have really taken steps, especially if they're in manufacturing or other types of production industries. They've also tried to create, or healthcare, which is a big area where this is happening. They've tried to create what's called a safety culture. Well, what's the connection between a safety culture and a culture of health? Basically, the two are almost perfectly interwoven. So again, these should not be separate areas of thinking and practice, but rather I'm encouraging organizations to look for ways to really bring them together. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using kind of an umbrella term or umbrella terms that really help to connect the various dots that are out there. Now, Alison has talked about wellness. I'm going to introduce a concept that is very complementary. In fact, it's often used in place of or alongside of wellness, and that's the concept of well-being. And it is the sort of the latest addition to the healthy workplace language. It's a concept that is found increasingly in academic research published in peer-reviewed journals, and so you've got a lot of researchers who are finding ways to really clearly define and accurately measure well-being, which is one of the things that really draws me to it. And basically, it's a positive state of a truly healthy organization where people's health, safety, and overall wellness are embedded into how the business operates and the overall goals of the organization. Well-being is an encompassing term, so it covers all the major life domains: your work, financial health, emotional, physical, behavioral risks. So that gets into the whole kind of workplace health promotion area where there's really a focus on physical health. And it also refers to the quality of social connections and community. And you can see that it kind of boils down to a person's overall quality of life or happiness. So you'll find, I mean, if you go out there, you can look at organizations like the OECD, which is kind of a big think tank for the major economies in the world. And, they publish quality of life indexes where they look at people's overall quality of life, and that speaks to the well-being of a population. Economists now are actually studying happiness, and it's very closely linked to economic performance, to organizational success, to the overall standard of life in a country. So this is, increasingly becoming a focus. And as I mentioned, it is this big kind of umbrella catch term that covers all of these things. So let's look at how well-being has been operationalized in the area of workplace health and safety. On the left is kind of an interesting example of the sort of really high quality research that's being published. This is a quote out of a major journal that looks at workplace health promotion called the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And it's a study that looks at organizations, basically big corporations that are publicly traded on the US Stock Exchange, that have participated in what's called the Corporate Health Achievement Awards. And basically it shows that the companies that score highly in these awards are integrating health and safety. They're building a culture of health. They're focusing on overall wellness or well-being. And as a result, they're performing better on the stock market which is a very clear indication of their business success. On the right is an interesting framework that's just recently come out. Again, the reference is in the bottom, from the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health in the US and the Centers for Disease Control. And the concept is total worker health. So that label tells you right away that it's really trying to integrate health, safety, total well-being into the goals and the kinds of programs that you're designing and implementing in your workplace. So now let me turn to the Great Place to Work data, because again, I want to thank GPTW for providing the data to me for this. So it's a slightly different way of looking at their data. And what I did was I put together the survey data from close to 50,000 employees in 200 organizations. And I basically rank ordered them based on their trust index score, which is basically the aggregated score of all the questions in the trust index survey. And I looked at the top 20 and compared them with all the others. And you can see that organizations that are being assessed overall as great places to work, as high trust workplaces, are psychologically and emotionally healthy, they're physically safe, and people are also assessing their work environment as being a really good environment for them to work in. So this immediately shows you the connections between a great workplace overall. Now, this is a very global concept, and a psychologically and emotionally healthy workplace. So that's, and I'd also like to point out that the physical safety piece is interesting, because overall Canadian employers over the last 15 or 20 years have done a very commendable job at reducing lost time work injuries and worker compensation claims. So it's not surprising that everybody is seeing this in their workplace. But what's interesting is that there still is a difference in those when you compare the top 20 organizations with the rest, and that to me is quite striking. So let's now turn to the national standard. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace identifies 13 workplace characteristics. And these are things that will immediately come to mind, I'm sure, for all of you as being influential on people's overall mental and physical health and safety. Culture, civility and respect, which is what Alison has really emphasized. People's job demands, which is something that in Jeffrey Pfeffer's book comes out as being really critical for overall health. People having involvement and influence, being able to manage the workloads, in just feeling engaged, work-life balance. So basically it's all there. And so what I did simply was to try to overlay this framework from the national standard onto the Great Place to Work data. And sure enough, you can do it. So this really is a mapping of the national standard against Great Place to Work questions. So what I did on the left side, you'll see in capitals, the factors, each of the 13 workplace factors from the standard, and then next to it in smaller font is the actual question that measures that factor in the Great Place to Work survey. And what I did was simply compare respondents from this group of 200 organizations that were measured. I looked at compared people who said that their workplace was psychologically and emotionally healthy almost always, and that's basically the so they're giving a very positive assessment to that, and compared them, and that's the blue line, with those who said that basically that only happens some of the time or not at all. So you can see that people who are just using this single question to identify a psychologically healthy and a safe workplace, all of these factors that are identified as critical in the national standard stand out as being very present. And I mean, in fact, to me, it's a very, very striking contrast when you look at how it's basically 90% or more of the people saying they've got a psychologically and emotionally healthy workplace saying that, yeah, like we've got all these things. So all the drivers, in other words, are in place according to the Great Place to Work survey. And what this tells us is, because if you back up to the comments Alison made, trust is critical. And that's really fundamentally what's being measured in this survey. So trust really is the foundation of psychologically and emotionally healthy work. So what are the practical insights here? Well, first of all, workplace health and safety experts advocate creating a culture of health and a culture of safety as building blocks. And this, if you know, go to any of the resources that are out there and you'll see these terms being used. So what the Great Place to Work data and the findings that we've shared with you today emphasize is that the only way you can achieve these goals is if you have a climate of trust in your workplace. So trust really comes first. Second point is that employers are able to improve employee well-being when they take a holistic approach and when they integrate all of these various areas that I hope I've shown you really do fit together very nicely. The other finding that I find very interesting is that this isn't just about psychological or mental health. It's also about physical health and safety. Because people who rate their workplaces as psychologically healthy are also giving very high ratings for the physical safety, which means that, I mean, you know, if you look at violence and harassment and abuse, that's definitely going to be completely absent from these workplaces. But other aspects that contribute to physical safety, just, you know, if they're in an industrial setting, it's going to be, you know, defined in more traditional terms as a safe environment. The other key point here is that all workplace relationships need to rest on a foundation of trust in order for work environments to be truly healthy, safe, and productive. So it's the relationships. And finally, for those of you who are considering or who have adopted the standard, a guiding principle for really trying to make progress, if you have adopted or are looking at the standard, is recognizing that central role that trusting relationships plays. So I'm going to end here. Let's open it up for questions. Thanks very much for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Graham, for taking us through the broader landscape. One of the things about what your points you were making about physical safety, organizations, I think, are still treating emotionally or mental health and safety very separate from their physical health and safety initiatives. Is there any recommendation you can make for employers to kind of bring those two together?
Yes, so the expert advice, by that I mean, you know, what you can read in these peer-reviewed academic journals, really encourages an integration of health and safety initiatives. Now, what's interesting is that the national standard for psychological health and safety has been designed to be basically integrated into an organization's existing occupational health and safety management system. So if you look at the details of the standard, the language it uses, the planning process, basically everything about it is seen as it is designed to come across to employers as not as something new and different, but rather something that is entirely complementary and additive to existing health and safety initiatives. So that to me is, you know, in Canada, I mean, it's a made in Canada resource, is really emphasizing the importance of that integration. In the US, and of course, this is attracting attention internationally, if you go to the slide on total worker health, I mean, that's essentially what it's all about. Because it comes out of, so where was it developed? It was developed with the involvement of the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health in the US, which traditionally has looked after, you know, physical health and safety. So again, you know, that's trying to pull it all together. So practically, if you've got two committees, if you've got a health and safety committee and a wellness committee going, find ways to coordinate what they're doing. Have somebody who's sitting on both, make sure that they're communicating. I mean, that would be a very simple step in that direction.
Great, that's awesome. I can see a lot of questions coming in here. If you haven't had a chance to post your questions, you can do so under the questions tab or the chat tab on your GoToWebinar panel. So let's get a couple more questions here. Most of these are for Graham, so that's awesome. So I've got one question. Within the top 20 organizations that you studied, was there a particular industry that stood out?
I didn't look at industry. I took the data that was provided by Great Place to Work. I do know that their participants in the Trust Index survey and the list process is quite diverse. Maybe Alison could speak to that.
So amongst our top quartile mental wellness organizations that we studied, it was really a cross-industry sector, which was great. So certainly we did have more prevalence from sort of IT companies, sort of modern, progressive companies, perhaps a little bit less from manufacturing, but it really was a cross-industry representation. I think underlying your question is the point that this is going to be easier for some organizations than others, right? So depending on the workplace setting, you want to speak to that, Graham?
Yeah, so having been involved with Great Place to Work going back to, as Alison mentioned, 2004, 2005, I know that in some industries, like for example, healthcare, which is a huge employer in this country, there has been interest, but there's been some hesitance to kind of invest the time and energy that's going to be needed. And in the biggest province, Ontario, healthcare organizations are required by the Excellent Care for All Act to actually submit as part of their quality improvement plans employee surveys, and there are surveys that are very specifically geared to a healthcare work environment. So for those organizations, while they're not on the list, I know that there's a lot of activity going on that is very complementary to what you have described. And frankly, look at what other organizations are doing and realize that yes, that's not us, but the principle of what they're trying to do, or the approach they've taken, or the process that they followed, still can be adapted to what we're doing. And that to me is the big takeaway here.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that, Graham. The other piece is, which I think sometimes discourages people or organizations from embarking on sort of a campaign to improve workplace mental wellness, is it's not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
And certainly when you're just starting on the journey, it's not going to be perfect. And so that's why we recommend, why don't you pick one or two things that'll get you sort of a little bit closer to that outcome?
Yeah, and I think that, the questioner's key point here is that, yes, the approach will definitely vary. I might recommend the 40 case studies that the Mental Health Commission of Canada published, and it's on their website, of organizations that adopted the national standard. And what's interesting about these case studies is that they cover the gamut in terms of organizational size and organizational sector. So you've got everything from small law firms to, I think, like even Alberta Health Services, which is enormous, and it's in healthcare. So you've got the full range, and the report identifies some of the common threads that kind of go right through all of the approaches in these very different organizations. So that might be something that could help people.
Yeah, and that actually, we've got a resource page at the end of this webinar. I will add the link to that one because I think you're absolutely right. So different sizes, different industries. Okay, a couple more questions coming in here. This one is also for Graham. What can someone who isn't in a management position do to improve the mental wellness of their workplace?
Okay, very good question. And this speaks to the point I made about how, in a truly healthy organization, you have many leaders. You have many people who can be change champions. And first and foremost, if you are really committed to improving the mental well-being of your workplace and your coworkers, talk about it, share resources, and essentially educate people. And this is really the starting point. And by having those conversations, which basically are non-threatening, you can just talk. And the fact that there are free resources, and another free resource, of course, is the Great West Life's Center for Mental Health in the Workplace, which is online and available to anybody. So simply by talking about these great Canadian resources, in addition to the resource that Alison has just published, A Great Place to Work, they're great talking points, and you will immediately see others who are interested, and that way you can create kind of a critical mass of people in the organization who are interested in actually trying to implement some of these ideas and adapt them. And if you can get a manager who's willing to actually be a champion of these sorts of initiatives, then that's really when you can start making some progress.
That's awesome, Graham. Great suggestions there. I've got another question, interesting question, which might stump you. I'm not sure. Okay. You mentioned that trust comes first, Graham. My experience and observations are that trust is actually an outcome of trustworthy behaviors by leaders, individuals, and the organization.
Right.
Can you comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely right. So it's not really a catch-22. And what I've seen, again, as a consultant working with many organizations, the point that I made about trust underscores the need to recognize the role that trust plays. Now, if you're in a low trust environment, that doesn't mean that you basically, pack up your tent and go home and forget about doing this. What it means is that you are 100% mindful of how every action you are going to take, and if you've got a wellness committee or some group that's sort of leading the process here, everything they do, every piece of communication, every announcement, every program they launch is an opportunity to rebuild trust. That's the key. So you're right. Trust is an outcome, but what I'm getting at is the lack of trust needn't be a barrier to progress as long as you are clear about this. Very few organizations that I've seen, they might have trust as part of their value statement, but very few actually say our big goal is to have a high trust workplace. Those are organizations that are likely to have engagement and employee health and safety or well-being as goals, but they recognize that a very synergistic result that comes along with achieving those goals is that high trust workplace.
Great. And then another question here. Someone interested in picking up your book on creating healthy organizations. When will the second edition be published?
Good question. I'm talking to the editor tomorrow. I expect early next year. That's how long it takes to kind of get this stuff. So, and it'll be widely available. Amazon. I've got a website for the book, so you can go there and order it. So
great, yeah. Great. And then quite a few questions have come in. Will we have a copy of the slideshow or today's presentation? And absolutely, yes, you will. We'll be emailing both a copy of the recording of today's presentation as well as the slides themselves. And contained in the slides, I think we have time for one more question before I get there, but contained in the slides, we hope to direct you to some of these excellent resources we were talking about. So, okay, here's an interesting question, which I could speak to. Are all generations in the workforce represented in these statistics? As mental health is a focus of a lot of turnover, especially in the service industry, is there representation on what age range struggles most with having a healthy workplace? So, so the answer to the first part of the question is yes, all generations are represented in our Trust Index database. So when we survey organizations, we typically survey all their employees or a good cross-section of their employees. Previous research from Great Place to Work has not identified as much difference by age demographic as you would expect. So I know in recent years we've had a lot of talk about sort of what millennials want, what the boomers want, and so on and so forth, but that's actually not really borne out in the Great Place to Work data. The second part of your question I find interesting, and is there a sector or an age demographic that seems to be struggling more with a healthy workplace? And that is a question I could answer for you next year, because we haven't segmented that piece by age demographic yet. But this year we've introduced a new demographic category into our Trust Index survey. So that is a topic for further discussion or exploration in the coming year. But thank you for that question. I would suspect that we're not going to see a huge spread in terms of what the different, who's struggling in the workplace, but that will be an interesting question for next year when our new demographic data is presented. Okay, I think we should probably wrap it up. We're approaching the end of our hour. Just gonna hide this here. And so just moving on to the last slide here, we would like to leave you with some takeaway resources for further reading on your part. So we've got here a link to Graham's recent article, High Trust Workplaces Promote Employee Wellbeing. And this is also a link to your website, I believe, Graham, yes, where people can find lots of resources there. For a Great Place to Work resources, I've provided the link to our new employer guide, Trust is the Foundation for Mental Wellness at Work. And so that is available as a free download. And so you'll see today we covered just parts of that data. So if you're interested in reading the whole thing, you can download that. And also, if you're interested in taking a look at the levels of trust in your workplace and perhaps getting certified as a great workplace, there's a great video. It's not a complicated process. It involves, us surveying your employees. We take care of all those details. And so take a look at that YouTube video to see how you can get started with the process. So thank you, Graham. It's a pleasure to have you here today, and thank you all for joining us today. And you will receive these slides and the recording in the next day or so.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure being here.
Okay, bye for now.